Tonight, as we end our time together, I want to share with you a powerful story that's found in Acts 27 and 28. You may have read it as a kid, but I want us to pay special attention to it right now. Paul is in lockdown. He's in chains. He's a prisoner on his way to stand trial before Caesar. And as they're making their way there, they're in this ship, and the ship hits a storm. And you've probably read this story before, but I want to remind you of it. And so as they begin to be buffeted by the storm, I'm amazed at how Scripture describes it. It calls it a hurricane force storm, if you read it in the NIV. And as they are buffeted by those winds, they can't even keep the sails up anymore. They're just driven by the storm. Now, some of us went through a storm a couple of weeks ago, but in that storm, we were in houses on land. Can you imagine being in a hurricane gale force storm out on the sea, pitch backwards and forwards? You're like me. I don't do very well on a boat anyway, never mind a boat that's pitching like that. In fact, it's so dangerous that they have to take ropes and wrap them around the hull of the boat just to be able to keep the boat together. And this doesn't go on for 4 or 5 minutes. It goes on for days. No sun, no stars. They're just out there in the middle of this terrible storm. And that's when something remarkable happens. Paul stands up and he tells the soldiers and the sailors, gather together. I want to share something with you. And the words out of his mouth are, take courage. Here he is in the midst of the same storm with them, with the same waves and the wind beating against the boat. And Paul has a courage that he can share with others. Take courage. He tells them, not one of your lives will be lost. An angel of God appeared to me and told me this, and I want you to take hold of God's promises and believe them. You see, when we're in a storm, it's easy to lose sight of the fact of God's presence. But here was Paul in the midst of the same storm with his faith in God strong. Reminds me of what happened when I was a senior in college. I was in my final year being a theology student, and I just had a wonderful birthday dinner with my mother. She drove back to her home, and I got a call from the dean the next morning that my mother, in the middle of the night, had had a heart attack and had passed away. You can imagine the personal storm I went through. I was just angry with God. God, why would you allow this? But he quietened me, and he said, I want you to have faith. And you know, when I looked for him in that storm, I found him. I don't know what storms you're going through. I don't know what challenges you're facing right now. But I know that some of you are in some pretty difficult storms. I want to encourage you to have faith, to have courage, because God is present. If you look for him, his angels will be right there with you, and they'll give you courage. So after Paul tells them to take courage, they continue going through that storm for 14 days, 2 weeks. They're out there, not even knowing where they're at. And then in the middle of the night, they begin to realize that they're getting closer to land. And as they're getting closer, the sailors get nervous because this is when you can break a ship apart. So the sailors say, hey, we need to lower some anchors, and so we need to get into the lifeboat to lower these anchors down. And Paul sees through their trick, because what they're really trying to do is to escape the boat, which would have meant disaster for everyone else. So Paul tells the centurion, this is their plan, and the centurion makes a radical decision. He cuts the ropes to the lifeboat, to the escape boat. Now there's a lesson in here for us. See, some of us are in a storm and we're looking for a way of escape. We're looking for a way to get out and not to follow what God has asked us to do, but to save ourselves. Some of our escape routes have been video games. For others, it's been YouTube or TikTok. For others, it's been maybe alcohol, or maybe it's just been some other drug of choice. And you've tried that escape route, and you know it's not going to save you, but you keep trying it anyway. And so what we need to do is exactly what that centurion did. We need to cut the escape routes, take off those escapism tendencies in the midst of the storm, and get back to what God is calling us to do. Well, it's getting to be towards daybreak, and Paul calls everybody together again, and he tells them, look, you haven't eaten for 2 weeks. You've been so stressed, so anxious. I want you to eat now. You're going to need the strength for what is to come. And then he prays and he breaks the food, and they have almost like a holy communion on those high seas. And as they're sharing that food and they're eating, it says there was enough for them to eat. In other words, they had had the food all along, they just hadn't eaten it. And there's a lesson in here for us too. Some of us in our storm have been so stressed, we haven't been with the Word of God, which is what that bread represents. We haven't had devotions. We've just been watching the news and watching the storm, the wind and the waves. But now it's time for us to eat. It's time for us to get back to that devotional life. And I believe if we do that, if we spend time with God, He'll give us a peace that passes understanding. And so they eat their food, the sun comes up, and they see that there's land ahead, which is a miracle in and of itself, because they were far from any land, and there's the island of Malta. So they make their way towards that land, and then they end up grounding against a sandbar, and the ship breaks up, and they all have to hold on to different pieces of wood broken up from the ship, and finally they land on the shore. And it's amazing, 276 men on board, and every single one is saved. So as they're climbing up onto the beach, they look like bedraggled rats coming in out of the rain, and they're tired, they're cold, the storm is still kind of raging on, they're shivering in the cold there, and the islanders come out. And it says that the islanders, according to the NIV, showed them unusual kindness. Now, they could have stayed in their homes. They've been through the same storm. They could have ignored these people. But there's something that happens when you see somebody in trouble, when their lives have been broken apart by a storm. Your heart goes out to them. And that's exactly what happened with those islanders. They care for them. And maybe in your storm, there's some people who've been stranded, who've been affected. You've been in lockdown, but your lockdown doesn't need to lead to a shutdown of God's grace, of God's love. Look around you. See who's on the beaches. See who's in a worse position and lend a helping hand. And you've certainly seen that happened in the storms we just had. Well, our story's almost over, but there's just 2 more incidents I'd like us to pay attention to. So as they build a fire for everyone and they're hauling some wood, Paul reaches in and he grabs some wood, and as he pulls it out, a viper comes out and bites Paul's hand. And the islanders are looking, they can see he's a man in chains, and they go, yeah, man, this guy come off the ship and he's saved, but look at him, man, he's getting a snake bite, he's going to die, maybe he's a murderer, and now he's getting justice for what he deserves. Well, Paul takes that snake and he shakes it, and then that snake is hanging on, its fangs are deep into his hand, and he shakes it again, and the snake falls into the fire. Who do you think that snake represents? That's right, it's the devil. And the devil wants to grab hold of us. We may have survived a storm, but we're still a little weary, a little battle-worn, and the devil tries to sink his fangs deep into us and try and make us just give up hope. But you know what Paul did? He shook that snake off. He shook the devil off and he sent him to the fire. God said that there is a fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And he just shakes the devil off and sends him where he belongs. Now, you won't be able to do this in your own strength. Some of you are discouraged. Some of you are depressed. Some of you have been struggling with a lot of different things in your lives. And you don't feel like you can shake loose. But as you put your faith in God, as you spend time with Him, as you get the sustenance you need from Him, you will get the strength to break loose from the devil's tentacles, from the way he's holding you back. And when Paul does that, everyone thinks like, wow, this man is great. How did he survive? Well, just after that, a citizen of the island, Publius, invites Paul and his friends to his home. And while they're there, Publius tells him that his father is very sick. And Paul goes in to see Publius's father. Remember, he's still a prisoner in chains. He's still in lockdown. And he sees Publius's father and he prays for him. And Publius's father gets well. It's a miracle. And then other people here, and they bring their sick people to Paul, and he prays for them, and they get well. You may be in lockdown, but that doesn't mean you can't pray for people. That doesn't mean you can't make a difference in their lives. It doesn't mean that you can give them hope and courage and healing. You may be in lockdown, but you can still pray. See, a lockdown doesn't lead to a shutdown of God's grace. So I don't know where you're at tonight, but I want to encourage you. I want you to have courage that God has a purpose for your life in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of these storms. When I was a campus chaplain, we were on our way to a camp out and I got the tragic news. 2 of my students had died in a car accident and 3 of them were critically injured and in hospital. I got to that camp out. I was so confused. What are we going to say? The next morning I had a guest preacher coming in and I told him the story and I said, I hope God's got a good sermon for you. And he said, I think God's got this. And then he stood up and he preached a powerful sermon about Jesus taking his people through the storm. But it's the way he ended that remained with me. I'll never forget those words till the day I die. He said, the greatest tragedy in life is not death, but a life lived without purpose. And when he made that appeal, I saw over 100 kids come up crying, kids who had been away from God, kids who had felt that God wasn't with them, and saying, I want to live a life of purpose. I want Jesus in my life. So as you face lockdown and storms and challenges, I want to ask you a question. Are you willing to let God live his purpose through your life? Are you willing to be like a Paul, to pray for people, to make a difference in their lives? And are you willing to let God's grace transform your circumstances?